glad you're here tonight. We're easing into a fresh episode together, and I'm opening Chapter 1 of Fiddler on the Roof. I'll read at an unhurried, sleep-safe pace, soft and steady, so you can drift as the village wakes. A fiddler's melody hangs in the dawn air, and quiet questions meet quiet faith. Settle in. I'll take it from here. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Tradition. The fiddler stood upon our roof in that peculiar hour before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath, suspended between the certainty of night and the promise of day. His silhouette etched against a sky of such indeterminate color that it might have been the very canvas upon which God was still deciding what manner of day to paint, possessed a quality of otherworldly permanence, as though he had always been there and always would be, playing his melancholy tune to an audience of stars that were, even now, retreating before the advancing light, like memories before the harsh illumination of present circumstance. I, Tevye the milkman, though to reduce oneself to such simple nomenclature seems somehow insufficient when one considers the vast complexity of any human soul, even one as ostensibly humble as my own, stood in the muddy courtyard of our dwelling, my breath forming small, ephemeral clouds in the crystalline air of what promised to be another day in Anatevka, that forgotten corner of the Pale of Settlement where the Russian Empire had seen fit to deposit us Jews like so much inconvenient furniture in a rarely used room. The cold penetrated through my worn boots with the patient persistence of poverty itself, that most faithful of companions, which had attended me since birth, and showed no signs of abandoning its post. The melody the fiddler drew from his instrument, if one could call that collection of wood and string and hope an instrument rather than what it truly was, an extension of his very soul, wound through the morning air with the sinuous complexity of smoke from the chimneys that were only now beginning their daily exhalations. It was a tune both ancient and immediate, carrying within its notes the accumulated weight of centuries of joy and sorrow, celebration and lamentation, the entire emotional archaeology of a people who had learned to pack their history into melodies that could be carried more easily than possessions when the next expulsion came, as it invariably would. I have sometimes thought his bow was not drawing across string at all, but across a single, invisible thread stretched taut over our village, a thread connecting the first memory of our people to the last of our hopes. It was the sound of that tension he played, a note so fine and fragile that a man might live his entire life and never hear it. Yet if it were to snap, the silence that followed would be the end of everything. His task, then, was not merely to make music, but to test the integrity of our existence with every note. How he maintained his balance upon that steep and treacherous roof, I could not say with any certainty, though I had developed my theories over the years of watching him. Perhaps it was the same mysterious force that kept us all from tumbling into the abyss of despair or apostasy or simple extinction, that combination of faith, stubbornness, and the invisible architecture of tradition that provided scaffolding for lives that might otherwise collapse under the weight of their own uncertainty. We were, all of us in Anatevka, fiddlers on the roof in our own fashion, performing our precarious dance between earth and heaven, between the demands of the body and the aspirations of the soul, between the world as it was and the world as we wished it to be. "You're up early, even for you," came the voice of my wife Golda, as she emerged from the doorway of our house, her figure wrapped in the thick shawl that had been her mother's and her mother's mother's before that, each generation of wear, adding to its character rather than diminishing it, much as our years together had worn grooves into our conversation that we traveled now with the unconscious ease of long familiarity. 25 years of marriage had taught us to communicate in a shorthand of glances and sighs, of meaningful silences, and carefully calibrated irritations that conveyed more than any flowery declaration ever could. "The cows don't milk themselves," I replied, though we both knew, she with the knowing that comes from decades of observation, I with the self-awareness that arrives, if at all, only in middle age, that I'd been standing there for a considerable time, lost in the labyrinth of my own thoughts. This was my luxury, these stolen moments before the day's labor began in earnest, when I could engage in my ongoing dialogue with the Almighty, a conversation that had been running, with various interruptions for sleep and necessity, for as long as I could remember. "Lord," I said quietly, directing my words upward while keeping my voice low enough that Golda wouldn't hear and add this to her already substantial catalogue of my foolishnesses. "I know we are your chosen people, but once in a while, can't you choose someone else? Not permanently, you understand. I wouldn't want to shirk our responsibilities entirely, but perhaps a brief sabbatical, a moment's respite from the honor of your constant attention." The fiddler continued his performance, oblivious to, or perhaps simply uninterested in, my theological negotiations. His melody had shifted now to something that seemed to contain within it the very essence of our village. The cramped houses leaning against each other, like drunken friends, providing mutual support. The rutted streets that became rivers of mud in spring and autumn, channels of dust in summer, and treacherous passages of ice in winter. The small shops with their hand-written signs in Yiddish and Russian, the synagogue with its proud poverty, maintaining its dignity despite the patches on its roof and the cracks in its walls. Anatevka was no Jerusalem, that golden city of our prayers and dreams. It was not even Warsaw or Odessa, those great centers of Jewish life where learned men debated the finest points of Talmudic law and merchants built fortunes that rivaled those of their Gentile neighbors. It was merely a small shtetl, one of hundreds scattered across the Pale like seeds thrown by a careless hand, some falling on fertile ground, others on stone, all struggling to take root and flourish despite the uncertain soil and hostile climate. Yet it was ours, this humble collection of buildings and souls, and in that possession lay a form of wealth that no amount of rubles could purchase. "The morning prayers won't say themselves either," Golda observed, her tone carrying that particular mixture of gentle reminder and implicit criticism that wives perfect over years of practice. "And you know how Mendel gets when you're late. Last week he started without you and got the entire congregation out of rhythm. We sounded like a collection of sick goats." I smiled at the memory, though I was careful to hide it from Golda, who disapproved of finding humor in sacred matters, or rather, who disapproved of admitting to finding humor in them, which was not quite the same thing. Mendel, our cantor, was a man of great piety and even greater anxiety, convinced that any deviation from established routine would bring catastrophe upon us all, that the catastrophes came regardless of our adherence to routine, seemed not to shake his faith in the prophylactic power of punctuality. I'm going," I said, though I made no immediate move to leave. The morning was too perfect in its imperfection, too precisely itself to abandon just yet. The sky had finally decided on a color, a pale, uncertain blue, like the eyes of a child who has just stopped crying but isn't quite ready to smile. The air carried the complex perfume of our village awakening, bread baking, fires being stoked, the earthy smell of animals stirring in their stalls, the sharp scent of leather from the cobbler's shop, already open despite the early hour because, as he liked to say, feet don't wait for convenient times to need shoes. From the inn, I could hear Mordecai already preparing for the day's travelers, though few enough stopped in Anatevka unless they had specific business here. As I stood there, postponing the inevitable commencement of another day's round of labor and prayer, I found myself thinking about the nature of tradition itself, that invisible web that held our community together more firmly than any walls or laws ever could. Tradition was the fiddler on the roof, maintaining his balance through sheer force of habit. It was Golda, knowing exactly how much salt to add to the challah dough, without measuring, because her hands remembered what her mother's hands had taught them. It was the way we all knew our places in the synagogue, the precise social choreography of our interactions, who could speak to whom and when and how, all of it encoded in rules that no one had written down because they were written in our very souls. Papa. The voice belonged to Tzeitel, my eldest daughter, who had appeared in the doorway behind her mother with that silent grace that always surprised me in a child I had once known as a creature of scraped knees and loud laughter. At 19, she had acquired a quality of containment, as though she were preserving herself for some future use that had not yet been revealed. Motel is here. He says you asked him to fix the tear in your Shabbos coat. I had made no such request, but I understood the fiction immediately. Mottel Camzoil, the tailor, had been finding excuses to visit our house with increasing frequency, his pretexts growing ever more transparent. Last week, it had been to return a thimble that no one remembered lending him. The week before, to ask my opinion on a theological question that a man who had studied Talmud as he had would never need a milkman to answer. Ah, yes, the coat, I said, playing along with the charade while watching my daughter's face, which maintained its composure even as a faint color rose to her cheeks, like dawn touching the hills. Tell him I'll speak with him when I return from prayers. Tzeitel nodded and disappeared back into the house, but not before I caught the brief look that passed between her and her mother, a look that contained entire conversations, negotiations, pleas, and permissions. Women, I had learned, possessed their own tradition, parallel to but separate from ours, transmitted in glances and touches, in the way they prepared food and mended clothes, in secrets shared over washing and whispered over sleeping children. The sun had finally committed itself to the day, painting the eastern sky with strokes of gold and pink that would have been garish in any human creation, but seemed perfectly appropriate when executed by the divine hand. The fiddler on the roof had ceased his playing and was making his careful way down, his movements deliberate and carefully placed, each foot finding its memorized hold. I wondered, not for the first time, what drove him to his elevated perch each morning. Was it merely eccentricity, or was there something about that height, that proximity to heaven, that allowed him to hear melodies that escaped those of us bound to the earth? Tevye. The voice that broke through my reverie belonged to Lazer Wolf, the butcher, a man whose prosperity sat upon him as conspicuously as his fine coat, which he wore even on weekdays, as if to ensure that no one forgot his status as one of Anatevka's more successful citizens. He was standing by his shop, already aproned despite the early hour, his thick arms crossed over his substantial chest. "A word with you when you have a moment?" "After prayers, Laser," I called back, though something in his manner, a certain purposefulness that went beyond his usual bluff confidence, made me uneasy. Laser Wolf was not a man given to subtle communication. When he wanted something, he generally came at it as directly as he approached a carcass with his cleaver. This unusual delicacy suggested something of significance. As I finally began my walk toward the synagogue, I found myself accompanied by Nachum the beggar, who fell into step beside me with ease. Nachum had been a fixture in Anatevka for so long that no one could remember him arriving. He seemed to have always been there, like the well in the market square or the ancient oak that marked the boundary between the Jewish and Christian sections of the village. "A fine morning, Reb Tevye," he said, his voice carrying the peculiar cheerfulness that only those who have nothing left to lose can truly achieve. "God has given us another day." "He has," I agreed, reaching into my pocket for the few kopecks I always carried for this purpose. It was part of our tradition, too, this daily transaction that was both charity and something more, an acknowledgement of our mutual humanity, perhaps, or a recognition that circumstances could change, that today's giver could be tomorrow's receiver. "May your prayers be heard," Nachum said, pocketing the coins with dignity intact. "And may your daughters find good husbands." The blessing, standard though it was, carried a weight that made me pause. 5 daughters were both my treasure and my terror, the gold that enriched my life, and the responsibility that sometimes threatened to crush me beneath its weight. Tzeitel at 19, Hodel at 17, Kava at 15, Sprinzu at 12, and little Bielku at 7, each one a universe unto herself, each one a mystery I would spend my lifetime trying to understand and would likely fail. The synagogue stood before me, its worn walls and patched roof, showing both our poverty and our persistence. Inside, I could already hear the murmur of morning prayers beginning, that ancient rhythm that had sustained our people through exile and persecution, through times when the very act of gathering to pray could mean death. I paused at the threshold, as I always did, to touch the mezuzah and bring my fingers to my lips, tasting the metallic coolness that always reminded me of the water from Yankel's well, which had its own distinctive flavor that spoke of deep earth and ancient stone. Inside, the familiar faces were already assembled in their customary places. Mendel stood at his lectern, his prayer shawl arranged with deliberate care. Avram, the bookseller, his eyes already closed in concentration. Yenta, the matchmaker, in the women's section above, her sharp eyes surveying the congregation like a general reviewing troops, calculating potential matches with the speed and accuracy of an abacus. As I took my place and began to wrap myself in my own prayer shawl, feeling the weight of its fringes and the history woven into its fabric, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with Laser Wolf, about the decision that would need to be made regarding Tzeitel, about the delicate balance between tradition and desire, between what was expected and what was hoped for. The prayers began to flow from my lips with the automaticity of long practice, but my mind was elsewhere, engaged in that parallel conversation with the Almighty that ran beneath the formal liturgy like a hidden river. "Lord," I said silently, even as my voice joined the communal chanting, "you have given me 5 daughters. No sons, which you know I have accepted without complaint. Well, without much complaint. But these daughters, Lord, each one is a riddle wrapped in an enigma, dressed in a mystery, and garnished with confusion. How am I to know what is best for them? How am I to choose between security and happiness, between tradition and love? You who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, surely you could provide a little guidance to a simple milkman trying to navigate the treacherous waters of matchmaking. The morning light streamed through the synagogue's windows, casting patterns on the floor that shifted and changed with the movement of clouds across the sun. It was like watching time itself made visible, the constant flux that we tried so hard to deny with our traditions and routines, but which continued regardless, carrying us all forward toward destinations we could neither predict nor prevent. As the prayers continued, I found myself thinking about the fiddler on the roof, about his precarious perch and his mysterious balance. We were all of us trying to maintain our equilibrium in a world that seemed increasingly tilted, where the old certainties were beginning to crack like ice in spring. The news that filtered into our village spoke of changes in the great world beyond, new ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking that threatened to sweep away everything we had known. And yet, here we stood, reciting the same prayers our fathers and their fathers had recited, clinging to our traditions like shipwrecked sailors to floating debris. The service was reaching its climax now, the congregation swaying in unison, our voices rising and falling in waves of supplication and praise. This too was tradition, this communal movement, this shared breath, this momentary dissolution of individual consciousness into something larger and older than any of us alone. In these moments, I could almost understand the fiddler's compulsion to climb to the roof, to get closer to heaven, to find that place where earth and sky met, and where perhaps the divine presence could be felt more keenly. When the prayers concluded and we began the ritual unwrapping of prayer shawls and phylacteries, the careful folding and storing that was itself a form of prayer, I noticed Perchik standing at the back of the synagogue. He was new to our village, a student from Kiev, who had arrived a few weeks ago with nothing but a satchel of books and a head full of revolutionary ideas that he dispensed with the enthusiasm of youth and the certainty of one who has read much but lived little. He caught my eye and nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and a subtle challenge, as though he were acknowledging our traditions while simultaneously questioning their relevance. Reb Tevye. Mendel approached me as I prepared to leave, his face bearing its perpetual expression of worry, as though he were personally responsible for preventing the sky from falling, and was not entirely confident in his ability to do so. About the collection for the new roof. I know, I said, reaching for my purse, though I knew it contained little more than the promises of payment I would receive for this week's milk deliveries. How much do we need? More than we have, Mendel replied, which was always the answer to such questions in Anatevka. But every kopeck helps. The rabbi says that God will provide, but I notice God expects us to do most of the providing ourselves. I gave what I could, which was less than I wanted, but more than I should, and made my way out of the synagogue into the full brightness of the morning. The village was fully awake now, the streets beginning to fill with the commerce and conversation that constituted our daily life. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing games whose rules seemed to change with each generation, but whose essence remained constant, the eternal game of chase and capture, hide and reveal, the rehearsal for life's larger dramas. Laser Wolf was waiting for me outside his shop, his impatience evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, making the wooden platform beneath him creak in protest. His shop window displayed the fruits of his trade, cuts of meat arranged with an artistry that seemed at odds with the brutal nature of their production, each piece precisely trimmed and presented like jewels in a merchant's display. "Tevye," he began without preamble, "I need to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy." Delicacy from a butcher? I couldn't resist the jest, though I immediately regretted it when I saw his face darken. "Forgive me, Laser. What is it you wish to discuss?" He glanced around, ensuring we were not overheard, then leaned closer, his breath carrying the metallic scent of blood that no amount of washing could entirely remove. "It's about your daughter, Zeitel." My heart performed a curious maneuver in my chest, something between a leap and a plummet. So it had come to this already, the first of my daughters to be sought, the beginning of the end of our family as it currently existed. I had known this day would come, had in fact worried about its delay, but now that it was here, I found myself unprepared for the complexity of emotions it engendered. "What about Zeitel?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well what about Zeitel. "I wish to marry her," Laser said, the words emerging in a rush, as though he had been holding them back by main force and could no longer contain them. "I know there is a difference in our ages, but I can provide for her better than any young man in the village. She would want for nothing, a fine house, servants, the best of everything." I looked at him, this successful butcher with his thick hands and prosperous belly, and tried to imagine my Zeitel in his house, at his table, in his bed. The images that came were not impossible, but neither were they inevitable. They had the quality of a story someone else might tell, not one that would write itself. "This is unexpected," I said, though it wasn't, not really. Laser had been a widower for 2 years now, and a man of his age and position would naturally seek a new wife. That he would look to the daughters of the village rather than seeking a widow his own age was perhaps vanity, but it was a common enough vanity. "Think about it," Laser said, sensing my hesitation. "Discuss it with your wife. But don't take too long, Tevye. I'm not the only one who has noticed that your daughters are becoming women." He left me standing there in the street, my mind churning like butter in a churn, unable to settle into any solid form. The sun had climbed higher now, and the day's heat was beginning to build, promising one of those oppressive afternoons when even the air seemed too thick to breathe properly. I needed to return home, to begin my rounds with the milk cart, but I found myself walking instead toward the edge of the village, toward the grove of birch trees where I sometimes went when I needed to think without the constant interruption of human need and observation. The trees stood in their delicate beauty, their white bark marked with black scars like an alphabet no one could read. I sat on a fallen log, its surface worn smooth by other villagers who had come here for their own moments of solitude, and tried to organize my thoughts into something resembling coherence. "Lord," I said aloud, there being no one to hear me but the birds and perhaps the Almighty himself, "you have set before me a problem worthy of Solomon himself. On one hand, Laser Wolf, a good man, a prosperous man, a man who could give my Seidel everything material she could desire. On the other hand, she looks at him the way one looks at a plate of cold soup, with resignation rather than appetite. And then there's Model, the tailor, who looks at her the way Adam must have looked at Eve when he first woke to find her there, with wonder and recognition and a kind of holy terror. A breeze moved through the birches, setting their leaves to whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. It occurred to me that this was perhaps the essential condition of fatherhood, to be always on the periphery of mysteries, understanding just enough to know how much you didn't understand. The walk back to the village seemed longer than the walk out, as though the weight of decision had added physical mass to my body. As I approached our house, I could hear the sounds of daily life within. Golda commanding, the younger girls laughing, the rhythmic thump of Zeidel's loom. It was the music of our existence, as familiar and essential as my own heartbeat. But there was another sound too. Model's voice raised an animated discussion about something, and Zeidel's laughter in response, a sound I realized I hadn't heard in some time. Not the polite laughter she offered to customers, or the gentle amusement she showed her sisters, but real laughter, spontaneous and unguarded, the kind that came from genuine delight. I stood outside my own door for a moment, caught between entering and remaining, between the future and the past, between what was expected and what was desired. The fiddler had returned to the roof, I noticed, his silhouette once again etched against the sky, his melody resuming as though it had never ceased. Perhaps that was the secret of his balance, not that he never stopped playing, but that he always began again, each note an act of faith that there would be another to follow it. With a deep breath that was part sigh and part prayer, I opened the door and stepped into my home, into the warm chaos of family life, into the beginning of changes I could sense, but not yet see, like thunder that rumbles beyond the horizon, announcing storms that will arrive in their own time, regardless of our preparations or protests. "You're late," Golda announced, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. "The milk will sour if you don't deliver it soon." "The milk is fine," I said, though in truth I hadn't checked. "Golda, we need to talk." She looked up then, her expression shifting through several variations of concern, before settling on wary attention. After 25 years, she could read the weather of my moods as accurately as any farmer could read the sky. "Girls, outside," she commanded, and our daughters filed out with only minimal protest, though I caught Seidel casting a worried glance in my direction. Only when we were alone did Golda speak again. "What is it? Has someone died? Are we being evicted? Have the cows gone dry?" No, nothing like that," I assured her, though I wondered if what I had to tell her might not be more momentous than any of those possibilities. "Laser Wolf wants to marry Zeidel." The spoon in her hand stopped moving, suspended in the pot like a question mark. "Laser Wolf the butcher?" "The same." She resumed stirring, but slowly, thoughtfully, as though the circular motion might divine the future like tea leaves in a cup. "He's old enough to be her father." "He's rich enough to be her husband," I countered, playing devil's advocate to my own doubts. "Since when do you care about riches?" Golda asked, but there was no accusation in it, only curiosity. "Since I have 5 daughters to marry off and no dowries to speak of," I replied, "since the world is changing, and who knows what tomorrow will bring. Maybe security is more important than other things." Other things, Golda repeated, and in those two words I heard volumes of unspoken understanding. She knew about model, of course. Wives always knew these things, absorbed them through some mysterious feminine osmosis that bypassed mere observation and went straight to certainty. What should we do? I asked, and realized with some surprise that I genuinely wanted her opinion, not just her agreement with whatever I had already decided. Golda was quiet for a long moment, her stirring taking on a meditative quality. When she spoke, it was with unusual care. Tradition says we should accept a good match, a prosperous man, security for our daughter, but tradition also says that a house built without love is just a shelter from the rain. And Tevye, our tzeitel, she's not the kind to be satisfied with just shelter. I stared at my wife, this woman I had lived with for a quarter of a century, and felt as though I were seeing her for the first time. When had she become so wise? Or had she always been, and I simply hadn't noticed, too busy with my own conversations with God to hear the wisdom that was right beside me? So, what do we do? I asked again. We do what parents have always done, she said, returning to her vigorous stirring as though the matter were settled. We worry, we pray, and we hope that our children are wiser than we were at their age. Though God knows that's not setting the bar very high. I laughed, surprising us both, and for a moment, the weight of decision lifted. But only for a moment. Outside, I could hear our daughters returning, their voices carrying the carefree music of youth, unaware that the melody was about to change, that the fiddler on the roof was preparing to play a different tune altogether. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope I helped you unwind and drift a little closer to sleep. If you're enjoying these readings, there's a whole library of full books and cozy chapters waiting for you over on my Patreon. If you are already a member, then I thank you. It includes exclusive content, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. You can also become a YouTube member if you haven't already, to listen ad-free and explore hundreds of other relaxing readings anytime you like. I'd love to have you there. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.